We talked about a little bit like what do they look like when they went in captivity and so on and so forth. And some of the things we've seen is that when this remnant is returning, they're very small, relatively speaking, to the size of the nation that used to be. They are incomplete in a lot of ways. Like some people don't know what family they belong to. There's some questions in the priesthood. The land itself is not in good shape where they come back to because so many things have been destroyed and now are just rubble or ruins. And there's just a lot of challenges, right, that they're coming back to. And so as we flip over into chapter 3 now, the real question is like, what are we going to see them do? Like I know y'all we know where the story's going, right? But this is kind of the lingering question. Now that these people have returned and God's promise to return them has come to pass, and they seem to be kind of fired up about that, like they want to come back. Their hearts have moved them to return. Like, what is it actually that we're going to see them do? What will they do now that their boots are on the ground and things are able to happen at this point? The first thing I want us to see is actually in Ezra chapter 2. When you look at the second chapter, according to the first and the last verses of Ezra 2, what are all the people doing? Where are they? Okay, so they move back, right? And once they get back, all right, it's right. It says in both places, right? So they've returned, and it says, basically it says that each went to his own town, right? Or they were in their towns, okay? And so it kind of seems like when you read that, it's just like that ended fast is kind of the impression, right? You read it like, well, they're just doing what they do, I guess, right? They all went home and started to hang out, and that's basically about where we are. I'm going to suggest to you, though, that we don't exactly know how much time has elapsed between when they came back and the beginning of chapter 3. And so what's the time in chapter 3, verse 1? What does it say? 7th month, okay? And it says, again, and the children of Israel were in the towns, okay? So we know where they were. I'm going to just say something to you here. I think that there's maybe two important things that we should consider here right from the get-go as we get into chapter 3. And I think the first one is that what it means when it says they were in their towns is that they went back to their familial cities or the places where their families used to live. We read about this a lot, actually, in the last few weeks, Wednesday nights in First Chronicles, those first 8 chapters, where it talked about who was whose family. And in some cases, especially we saw this with the Levites, talked about all their cities, right? Who lived in which city and all these things. And I think actually what it's just showing us here is that I actually think this is a good thing. Like they've come back to the land. They're not just kind of just loosey-goosey and like, let's just pitch some tents and let's be where we want to be. Like they all go back to where they're supposed to be, right? Because remember, that was a big part of the whole tribal setup and identifying everyone's families. And in fact, we recounted that same history this past Wednesday or past couple Wednesdays in Chronicles, where it kind of geographically goes around, remember the land, and says these people lived here, these people lived here. Like everyone had their place. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing here is that when they get back, the first thing they do is everyone kind of goes back to their place. Right? Where are we supposed to be? Let's get there. Okay, so I don't want to read too much in it. That's how I kind of read that, though, is that they've kind of gone back to say, let's just kind of set things up here, right, where we're supposed to be. The second really important thing here is that so they're living where they're supposed to be until the 7th month. And if you highlight in your Bible, you should highlight that, verse 1, where it says, until the 7th month, because this is a big, huge deal. And, if you like to write in your Bible, like you could write an arrow, say the providence of God right here. Because God has brought them back at maybe the most important time of the year for them, where they can turn their attention. Sometimes they turn around and, it's the 7th month. And for the Jews, the 7th month is a huge deal. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at that this morning. I don't think this is quite an accident. I see it very providential that they have arrived back into the promised land just in time to turn their attention to the seventh Jewish month now, as we're going to read about. What does it say that the first thing was that they did? Because they gathered together in Jerusalem. See that around in verse 2, I think. But what's the first kind of action that they take, according to the text here? What's that? They built the altar. Okay, so which altar do we mean? There's lots of altars in the history of Israel, right? Which altar is this that they built? What? All right, so you see that? It says in verse 2, right? It says they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Okay, so this is the altar of burnt offerings. And so I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back a bit to studies and lessons we've had about the tabernacle or the temple. And remember that when you would walk into the courtyard in front of the temple, there was the altar of burnt offering, right? And so whenever, almost exclusively, whenever we read in the Old Testament that you made a sacrifice, that's where you made it, right? It was on that altar there. And so that is not accidental. There's absolutely no way, okay? They built the altar for an intentional purpose. This is an easy question. Why did they build the altar of burnt offerings? Okay, it was commanded to make burnt offerings. That's right. That's on after. Okay, so they built it because they know that the first thing we should do here is we should make some sacrifices, right? Before everything gets going here. Keep in mind, please, that for 70 years they have not made sacrifices. That wasn't allowed. They didn't have a temple. They didn't have the altar to make the sacrifices. So for however many generations you want to slice that, they have not done this. Okay, now think about that when we studied, when was that when we studied Leviticus and those Pentateuch books earlier this year, last year even. I mean, they are just, it is you are nonstop killing animals, right? There is, we are always sacrificing an animal. When they get taken into captivity, that's done. It stops. There's no more sacrificing animals. There's no more, if you will, constant flow of blood as a reminder of sin and forgiveness and atone. All those things just stop. And so they come back into the land. It's the seventh month. Let's build that altar. Right? And they build it, and they are getting ready, and they're going to, we'll see this, they are going to make sacrifices. Okay? Now, I could be wrong about this. I think the last chronological time in the Bible before this that we're going to see burnt offerings recorded is way back in 2 Chronicles 35. And I think this was Josiah. Right? That's the one I could find, the last kind of recorded account historically before this, when they kind of all get together and make sacrifices. Okay? And there was a lot, by the way. I'll just kind of tease that out there. If you want to go read 2 Chronicles 35 at some point, there's a lot of sacrifices going on in that chapter. So it's been a minute since any sacrifices really have been made at this point. And you see here, if you skim, I don't know, really just the first handful of verses, 6 verses maybe, you can kind of see in there that, verse 3, they set the altar in their place, and it says they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord. Burnt offerings morning and evening, and they kept the feast of booths, as it is written. They offered the daily burnt offerings by number, according to the rule, as each day required. Verse 5, after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings of the new moon, and all the appointed feasts of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a free will offering to the Lord from the first day of the seventh month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. Okay, so just in case you and I have any question, there are a lot of burnt offerings going on. Right? It's it is literally, the text is saying it's nonstop. Right? They got back, they built the altar, let's sacrifice some animals here. All right. So they are very quickly, as we've seen, they've come back to the land. They're all living in their places assigned by God. And now they are immediately making offerings as instructed by God. Okay? This is a good start. Okay? If we're going to ask that question, I wonder what this will really look like. Because we know the history. The Israelites are kind of fickle sometimes. They don't always do what God wants. It's like they're back with a vengeance. Right? Let's get where we need to be. Let's start making the sacrifices. Let's just get this train rolling. And that's really what we're seeing here kind of presented to us here in the text from the get-go in Ezra chapter 3. Right? So off to a relatively good start, generally speaking. I'll pause for a second because I don't want us to get confused here. I just want to talk real quick about the dates that we're going to see, basically from this point on in the text. We're going to see dates in here. It's going to tell us when things happen in a few different ways, unfortunately. And remember, that's because the chronicler, or Ezra in this case, that's not his concern. His concern is not necessarily to put things in an order for us, right? So we know this happened first, this happened second. That will come into play from time to time. But it's more important that things are being recorded to tell this story, right? Like, what is it that we're supposed to take from this? So anyway, all that to say, just for trivia, the first thing you're going to see is like chapter 3, verse 1. All right, so we're going to get some things described to us relative to the Jewish calendar. Right, so when it talks about the 7th month, that means the 7th Jewish month, the 7th month of the Jewish calendar. And so we're going to see some things here that are going to happen to coincide with that. The second thing you're going to see from time to time is if you look down in verse 8, it says here, now in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem in the 2nd month. So that's a date based on when they returned. Okay, so we got those dates too. And then thirdly, sometimes we're going to see dates relative to the reign of the king in Persia. So you see that, I just found one in chapter 4, verse 24. It just says, the work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Okay, so there's just a couple of different ways that it's going to tell us when things happen. That is just kind of if you see a date, you might just want to pause and really think about it for a minute longer so we don't get confused, because sometimes it won't be so specific. It'll just say the 3rd month, and we're supposed to know, is that the 3rd Jewish month? Is that the 3rd Darius month? Is that the 3rd month from when we got back to the temple? Like, how do you understand these things? So just a little bit of different dating systems going on there to pay attention to, okay? And really that's because, again, Ezra is trying to direct our attention to particular ways of thinking here based on the history of the people and how it unfolds. So the dates are not necessarily always the key thing. Okay? So we mentioned this, right? That it's the 7th month, really, when things start to happen now. That the people, get going here, and we're going to see things happen. And so here is, I'm going to reuse this slide as we go forward in our classes. Maybe not today again, but just to help us understand and level set a little bit about, just like I said, when things will be happening one after the other. And so following the return, everyone's in their towns. Ezra chapter 3 talks about the 1st year of the return of the 7th Jewish month, which is called Tishri. And so that is a very key month for the Jews. We're going to spend time on that this morning. In fact, we just mentioned it briefly, but what does it say? Which feast did they keep? Now that they've returned to come to Jerusalem, made the altar, what do they keep? Feast of Booths. Okay, so you see that there in verse 4, right? It says it kept the Feast of Booths as it is written. And so we're going to spend some time talking about the Feast of Booths today. I've given you all these verses here in case you want to write them down, or I can text them to you, or whatever, if you want to reference them later on. But we're actually going to go back to Leviticus 23 a little bit this morning. We're going to talk about this Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tabernacles, it's called sometimes. And again, you notice that it says they kept the Feast of Booths in Ezra as it is written. Well, it is written in Leviticus 23, right? So this is what they're doing when they come back. And I want to stress before we kind of dig in here a little bit the significance of this, because remember, so many of the problems that we have seen culminated in the captivity began back with the divided kingdom. Remember when Jeroboam decided that we'll do something, but we're going to just do it our way, right? We're going to have our own kind of flavor of worship to God. We'll have our own kind of temple. We'll have our own kind of priests. We'll have our own thing. It's important when we read this and it says the people did it like it was written. Okay, they're not going back to Jeroboam. They're not going back to anybody. They're going back to the law. How are we supposed to do it? That's how we need to do it. Okay. So Leviticus 23, if you don't know, this is the feast chapter. If you ever have a question about a Jewish feast, shot in the dark, you'll probably find the answer here in Leviticus 23. And we're going to look particularly at what it describes here as the Feast of Booths. I'm just going to read this. It begins in verse 33 of Leviticus 23. I'm going to read it. We'll talk about it a little bit. We'll layer some other things on here. But here's what it says. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days is the Feast of Booths to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as times of holy convocation for presenting to the Lord food offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifices, and drink offerings, each on its proper day, besides the Lord's Sabbaths, and besides your gifts, and besides all your vow offerings, and besides all your freewill offerings, which you give to the Lord. Okay, so we'll just pause there. And I kind of read that extra because there's a lot of, I hope we're seeing the parallels between what was described in Leviticus 23 relative to how you keep feasts and what we're seeing in Ezra 3 when the people get back and they are keeping all the feasts and the free will offerings and the grain, like it lists almost all the same things that they're doing. Okay, so from Leviticus 23, what were some of the keys that it told us there about the Feast of Booths? What were some of the kind of the components of it that happened during that feast? What's that? Food offerings is one. Okay, so that goes along with it. What else? Okay, that's a big part, right? They're living in booths or tents for a week, right? And I don't think it's said here. Why did they do that though? This is easy. You could guess this if you didn't know. Why did they go live in tents for a week? What were they supposed to be thinking about? Living in the wilderness in tents, right, for 40 years, absolutely. Okay, so it's a reminder, harkening back to a time when they did not have a land, when they were not exactly a people, certainly before they had any king or tribal divisions or structure, like that was pre all that, right? This time in the wilderness where God supplied them and God led them and God provided for them, right? All of those things, okay? What else? Anything else kind of stands out to you from what we just read about that Feast of Booths? What? No work, right? No ordinary work was to be done. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah, okay. And it talks about, a couple times it said there's a holy convocation, right? So we're having the feast, but even while we're having the feast, there's going to be like a special gathering. I think it's at the beginning, there's a special gathering at the end. So in between us not doing any work, we're also spending time getting together and kind of being before God, right? Jen?
It's a time of rejoicing.
Yeah.
And celebrating.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, we didn't get down to there, but thank you for skimming ahead. It also talks about the celebratory nature of the feast. Like it wasn't, don't think that they all got together and like, chanted in weird, sad tones for 7 days and that was it, right? I mean, it was supposed to be like a rejoicing time, okay? And so you put the pieces together, they're thinking about, do you remember when we were just in the desert and we had nothing? And now, where are we? We're in the promised land and God has given us everything, right? And so we can remember the times of lack and celebrate the times of plenty and blessing. So that was kind of the whole gist of things going on. Okay. Before we head back to Ezra, I also want to look at Numbers 29, because Numbers 29, so if Leviticus 23 is about kind of summarizing the feasts of the Jews, Numbers 29 is more about summarizing like the sacrifices, that went along with the feasts. Okay, so if you look at Numbers 29, beginning in verse 12, it's going to start a lot of the same way. On the 15th day of the 7th month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. You shall keep a feast to the Lord 7 days. And you shall offer a burnt offering, a food offering, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord, 13 bulls from the herd, 2 rams, 14 male lambs a year old without blemish. The grain offering, I'm just gonna summarize. The grain offering is in detail there. It talks about how much of each thing. On the second day, you see this in verse 17, 12 bulls from the herd, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, etc., etc. Verse 20, on the third day, 11 bulls, 23. On the fourth day, 10 bulls, 2 rams, etc. And it goes down for every day of the feast. So for 7 days, they got together and they offered a bunch of animals. I'm not trying to be weird. I don't know how long it takes to kill and carve up 11 bulls. I suspect it's not quick. Okay. So every day, though, they're gathering together. They're pulling together all these animals over the course of the feast. It's 70 bulls are going to be offered. Okay. And so all these reminders here, we understand the kind of the symbolism in the sacrifices. And then I think to Ethan's point, each day, that's not all, right? They're also offering lambs. They're also offering grain and food. Like it's 7 days of celebration, but a lot of killing of animals, right? Lots of sacrifices are going on here. So when we read in Ezra, okay, you can't throw the verses out, right? When you read in Ezra and it says they kept the Feast of Booths, like you have to bring in the backstory. That's not like a one-off. Let's spend 5 minutes doing this. It means, and it says as it is written, right? So they get all the animals together, right? Get the priests together. Let's get the people together. Let's sacrifice these animals. Let's rejoice. Okay, tomorrow let's do it again, and then again, and then again for 7 whole days. Okay, so it's a big deal here, encapsulated in just one sentence. Okay. Trivia. Anybody else know what else is associated with the Feast of Booths? Besides the sacrifices, besides the memory of the sojourning in the wilderness? You don't have to know this one. I tell you instead of this chapter. Okay, it's also sometimes in Deuteronomy 16, it's called the Feast of Ingathering, because they had gathered in the harvest. So while they are thinking about the fact that we are no longer sojourning in the wilderness, they're also thinking about the fact that look at the bountiful harvest we just brought in because God blessed us. Yes, sir.
What they should have been thinking about at this point was the Feast of Trumpets, time of reflection, Rosh Hashanah, the new year now for the Jews that they celebrate. And the biggest holiday of the year is in between the two, the Day of Atonement that they've been thinking about. So there's a lot of reflection, a lot of thankfulness to God, a lot of considering of their inadequacy of their own selves. They should have gone on with all these things, how they needed atonement, and now there's a celebration with this Feast of Booths that recognizes the greatness of God and all He's done.
Yeah. I mean, it's so well said, right? So the 7th month is not like for us, we're just like, oh, July 4th, that's cool, right? For the Jews, they're like, okay, let's get ready for this, right? Are all the animals picked out? Is everything ready to go? Are all the people coming back to Jerusalem, which all the Jewish males had to return to Jerusalem to keep this feast? It's a huge, huge deal with all of those components being front and center for them, okay? Deuteronomy, Exodus 23, it talks about when it describes this, that the people were not to appear before the Lord empty-handed. And there's some symbolism there because the idea was how can we? The Lord has blessed us so bountifully. Of course we'll come to the Lord sacrifice with all manner of things. That was the idea. There was never supposed to be a question. Will we have enough to sacrifice to the Lord? Of course they would, because God blesses his people. Okay. In 1 Kings 8, we also notice from that text that when Solomon finished the temple, and moved the ark into the temple, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. That was also around the time of the Feast of Booths. So you can file that one however you want to. Kind of intriguing that when the first temple was finished, it happened to be the Feast of Booths, and now they've come back to rebuild the temple, and it happens to be the Feast of Booths once more. One thing that we'll look at, in fact, I want us to look at this for a moment, is if you turn also, I know I'm having you go all over the place, turn over to Zechariah, nearly the end of the Old Testament. And so we're gonna spend more time on Zechariah later, because Zechariah is actually going to show up for us in Ezra in chapter 5. It'll be one of the key prophets here. But if you look at Zechariah 14, this is also, to me, this is really cool. We're going to see this too. I'm just going to read chapter 14 for you. So Zechariah in chapter 14 is prophesying, he is talking about the coming day of the Lord. Okay? So that's, to this people that we're reading about now, this is part of the prophecy to them. Here's what he says. We're just going to read all of chapter 14. Behold, the day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward, and the other half southward, and you shall flee to the valley of my mountains. For the valley of the mountains shall reach into Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake. In the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day living waters shall flow up from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. The whole land shall be turned into a plain, from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site, from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's winepress, and it shall be inhabited. For there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. So I might just pause there and just make the point that there is obviously a lot of figurative language going on here. So we'll come back to this in future classes, but be thinking about this right now. Like, this Zechariah is going to show up and prophesy to the people who returned in Ezra. So be thinking about that, like, why on earth is this the message, right, that Zechariah would deliver? But for now, keep reading with me. Verse 13, and on that day, a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. And if any of your families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, and on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt, and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. And on that day there shall be inscribed in the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord. And the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar, and every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts, on that day. Okay, so I appreciate your patience while we read, but hopefully you see why we just read Zechariah 14. Because 3 times in Zechariah's prophecy, he brings up the Feast of Booths. Okay? He says this is going to be like a hallmark, right? This is going to be a sign to you. Like the people that really are intent on following God and being his people and being in his kingdom, they're going to keep the Feast of Booths. Like it's going to be important to them to do that. All right. This is actually the prophecy. Zechariah 14 is basically the reason why following this is a Jewish tradition. The Feast of Booths becomes the one feast where the Jews actively expect the Messiah to return. So when you get into the New Testament, and we're reading about in the Gospels about Jesus, and he's doing things, and it's the Feast of Booths. To the Jews, they were like expecting. Like I wonder if like this might be when the Messiah showed up. Like it had gotten that association for them, basically from this prophecy here. So it becomes something quite significant in terms of Jewish tradition from this point forward too. Okay, so not only is it's just not a coincidence. Like it's a real shortcut way of describing everything we're talking about here. It is no coincidence, right, that God brings the people back, and it's time for this, right? It is the 7th month. It is the Feast of Booths, and all of these things are just going to kind of culminate here, right? And this is what the people are going to focus on as soon as they ride together, okay? So a whole bunch of stuff going on here. If we go back to Ezra now, if I can go back to Ezra now, okay? We're actually going to kind of double down on some of the comments that Phil just made, because this is not the only thing happening in month 7. All right, so not only is the Feast of Booths going on, the Feast of Booths, though, if you remember from what we read, doesn't start until about midway through the month. The first thing is the beginning of the month is Rosh Hashanah, right, which happens on the 1st and 2nd days of the same month. And this is the Jewish New Year. Okay, so I won't take you there, but again, if you want to read more about it, Leviticus 23. If you want to read the sacrifices for it, Numbers 29. Okay, but it was like the start. Okay, so again, let's just appreciate that they've come back. It's the 7th month. Traditionally, they would be thinking about we get to start again. And what a start at this point. They have returned from captivity. They've kind of settled in their lands. They've come back to Jerusalem. What a great way to start again. Right? They're starting again in so many different senses here, coinciding with the beginning of the Jewish New Year. Okay? And then maybe the last piece we'll want to throw in here is in verse 5 of Ezra 3, when it says, all the appointed feasts of the Lord. That does mean also Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Okay, so to Phil's point again, right? Yes, it was celebratory. Right? Yes, it was. The Feast of Booths was supposed to be a big party. They're remembering kind of fresh starts, freedom from Egypt, salvation in the wilderness, all these things. But the 10th of the month is the Day of Atonement. So again, Leviticus 16, Numbers 23, you can find out more, but this is a key one. Yeah.
There's a whole year that was marked by the time of the Passover, which would have been the first one. So that's good to remember that, don't get confused. This is the first of the year in the national sense.
Yeah.
It's not the religious sense.
Yeah, because these are the first of the year. All right, for the Jews. But you're right, yeah, sometimes it's 2, and so it can be confusing. Yeah, but think about that too, right? That when it describes all the other appointed feasts of the Lord, the Day of Atonement is in here too. And boy, do they have a lot to atone for, right? I mean, again, for 70 years in captivity, they have not done anything that the law of Moses commanded. Not because they didn't want to, like they could not. All right, for 7 generations, 7 decades, they have not done any of these things. And so they come back, it is the 7th month, and they are out the gate with vengeance. right? We're going to make all these sacrifices. We're going to keep all these feasts, right? Over and over again. Like this is going to be a huge focal point for them. And it is so key that this is when it happens. Okay? So I want us to see a couple things here as we kind of wrap up most of this first chapter here in Ezra chapter 3. The first thing I want you to see is so important is that you can look through Ezra 3 and you're going to see a theme going on through here. Okay, so in verse 2, it says that they offered burnt offerings on the altar as it is written in the law of Moses. In verse 4, it says, and they kept the Feast of Booths as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule. In verse 10, when it's talking about what the Levites were doing, and it's fast forwarding to them laying the foundation of the temple. So we'll get there a little bit more detail later. It says that the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, they praised the Lord according to the directions of David, the king of Israel. Okay? So this is not just lip service. This is super important, okay? Because this is how they got into captivity, was by ignoring the rules, right? By not doing exactly what the law told them to do. Now, multiple times here, right, in chapter 3 alone, what does the law say? That's what we're going to do, as it is written, as it was commanded, as it was directed, as we've received the instructions. They do it exactly, okay, exactly. So these people, out of the gate, remember we've talked about this now. First 2 chapters, first 8 chapters of Chronicles. It's a bit of a sordid history, right? We know this. They knew it too. Right? When they show up here, okay, like our ancestors, they messed up, right? They didn't do the things that they needed to do. They went out on their own multiple times through history. We wound up in captivity. Now we're back. We're not making a mistake. We're going to do what it says to do. Okay. And keep in mind, we talked about this in our last class on Wednesday. They have the Levites with them. The Levites have come back. The priests have come back with them. And so those folks know the law. Okay, and so remember that's the contrast we made, that before the captivity, the whole land had Levites all over the place. If you needed to know the law, you just go ask the Levite. And they just didn't do that. Right? And they went away into captivity, first Israel and Judah. Now they've come back. The priests are back with them. The law is back with them, and they're on it, right? As it is written, so we shall do. And so that's what they're doing. Okay, a super good start to all this. Yes, sir.
In verse 11, and they sang responsibly, praising and giving thanks to the Lord.
Yeah. Isn't that great? Yeah, verse 11. And again, we'll cycle back to this, I think, next week. But again, they've laid the foundation of the Lord, and so it is the culmination. Because again, we're meant to kind of ingest all of this at once. Like, what does this look like? They come back. What does the law say? Let's do it. Let's make sacrifices. Let's build the temple. Let's go. And you kind of see that culminating there, that they sang, right? When all this, they've got the right attitude, responsibly praising, giving thanks to God for His good, for His steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. That's also not a throwaway sentence, because His love has endured for 70 years in the captivity. And now that they come back, they are feeling God's love again, right? Because they're doing the right things. God's love has been waiting for them for 7 decades, longer than that. And they're here and ready to take advantage of it. Okay? Great point. Okay. Let's talk about, so a few minutes left, let's talk about applications. So again, what are we going to do with this? Okay, so this is the first one we already talked about here. That from the text, part of the message being presented and reported is the importance of doing what God's law says. Right? It's not okay to come back and just think good thoughts about God, or to do a part of God's law, like every appointed feast is kept. They're all kept exactly in the way the law of Moses prescribed. They're doing it exactly the way God wants. Okay, so that's kind of point number 1. Right? It's important to do what God wants, how He wants it. What other applications? Do you see anything else that kind of stands out to you from what we've just been talking about today? What other applications can we kind of take with us? I have a couple. I'll fill the silence if it exists. But does anything occur to anyone else when we dig through here, trying to think about what should we take away. Luis?
It's not how I feel, or my opinion, it's what's written.
It's what is it? Absolutely. Right. And again, keep in mind that they've got this much of their Bible, remind them of how they didn't do what was written, right? And so they've come back, and we're going to do it, right? Yes, sir.
You touched on it, but His mercy endures forever. It's a reminder for us that God has always been merciful. And so it always bothers me a little when I hear people talking about how the Old Testament was just a law of words and laws and not grace. Every time you show me something where God is gracious in the New Testament, I can take you to a place in the Old Testament and show the same thing.
Yeah. It always strikes me when I refer to Kings 17, when it describes the downfall, right, of Israel and the beginning downfall of Judah. Like that chapter alone is full of grace, right? To your point. I mean, think about how long God didn't destroy Israel. Gave them opportunities and prophets to give them time to repent. His mercy and grace so evident there.
I think something I see a lot in this chapter is the idea and importance of praise and worshiping God. They're coming back to rebuild everything. There's so much work to be done. And yet, the first thing we really have recorded in depth is that they didn't work. They instead had a feast to worship God.
Yeah.
And they praised Him and worshiped Him and returned to the laws and reorient themselves. Many people would say that you're putting off the work that needs to be done, and yet that was still amongst everything that needed to be done. Still the most important.
Yeah. Particularly, right? They celebrate feasts in which it is commanded that you must not work, right? So that's a great point. Like, there's so much to do. And this is where we're going to start, right? And
So this is a little bit weird, but one thing it highlights for me is just that we are not Jews. And I think about God leading the Jewish people through this restoration, through the restoration of worship and all these things, but we're not Jews. So that reminds me that God did all of this so that He could bring us to Himself, just as He had done with the Jews.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we basically touched on that, right, when we read Zechariah. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff in Zechariah 14 that is not Jew forward, okay? Right? It's bigger than that somehow, and that's to Jen's point. Like, as we're reading this, we should be appreciating, like, wow, look at what God did for these people who threw God in the trash can multiple times, and over hundreds of thousands of years, really. This isn't like, oh, we messed up once. For so long, they discarded God, and yet His mercy, His grace, His oversight, just all the things He puts in place to bring them back to Him. It's all laying a foundation for us, right? To approach God in the same way. Like, what has God done for us? So much, right? It was very practical for them. It's even more magnificent for us, right? This isn't. I've said this before. God is done doing small things. This is all small stuff. To preserve a people for 7 decades so He can bring them back at the right time and facilitate it. It's chump change anymore. God is not going to do the simple stuff anymore. He's going to do even more magnificent things, and we're going to be the recipients of that. Okay, thank you all very much. Good comments. There are questions for the next 2 weeks for Ezra, and for this Wednesday's class in First Chronicles up front if you want to grab those.